Thank you so much for watching this online video tutorial. Like, comment, and share, as well as subscribe to our channel at Good Better Best Online Videos for more video content. Greetings formally to all that's going to be watching this tutorial later, and to all of those present with me right now. As you can see, the title on our little presentation space here is nuclear power, or I just titled it as nuclear, but we're going to be having a look at nuclear power in South Africa, where all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plus me, 6 of us live. Okay, so I mentioned this a bit last week, but I'll mention through the stats that I went through last week, just towards the end of our session, which that South Africa's nuclear power only generates 5%, right? 5% of electricity in South Africa. Okay, which I'll shorten just to SA. Okay, so we only use the nuclear power to generate 5% of our country's electricity, right? So what's happening to the other 95 comes from, of course, majority of the 95% would obviously come from our coal power stations, while some of that percentage also coming from the alternative sources, which we mentioned early on in the previous session, rather. Okay. Now, again, the power station, the nuclear power station, is actually called Koeberg, right? Or Koeberg Nuclear Power Station. Okay, but it's found, of course, near Cape Town in Koeberg, as the actual place, geographical location of where the nuclear power plant would obviously be found. Okay, I personally have never been there. I've never driven to Koeberg to go and see the nuclear power station. Personally, I've never been there. Would love to, but yeah, you can Google it, of course, on Google, just to see how it looks. Okay. Now, what does the nuclear power plant here in South Africa, or nuclear plants any other way in the world, but what do they use as fuel to power their power stations, or to actually generate electricity? Okay, they use something called radioactive fuel. You spell that Oprah. Radioactive fuel. Okay, and the radioactive fuel that they use is called uranium. All I know is that uranium is super radioactive. Now, what does radioactive mean? Is it's a self-generated giving off of energy, all right, as rays or as waves, in the form of particles as a consequence of a nuclear reaction. Okay, so in other words, this energy just gives off itself, all right, in the form of rays or waves. Okay, so just like the sun uses sun rays, all right, if you get exposure to these uranium rays or radioactive waves or particles in the air, of course, it'll do some serious damage to our bodies. Okay, serious damage. As Africa has uranium as a resource, and I see, yes, it's not a metal per se, might be a natural earth metal rather, so, but you'll learn more of that, I think, in grade 10, 11, but 10 mostly. It is mined from the earth. It's actually found inside the earth. Okay, so it is mined. It's also non-renewable. So if we lose out on uranium, the question would be, what else are we going to use as radioactive fuel to keep this nuclear power plant actually going? That's a good question to ask. Let's put in brackets here, it is non-renewable resource as well. Yay. Carrying on. Okay, so how does it work? Okay, let's ask ourselves that question. Okay, how does it work? Okay, simple. Okay, I'm not sure what a piece of uranium would look like, but let's just use a piece of an object to kind of like depict it, right? So let's say here's a piece of uranium that is mined. Okay, uranium. Okay, so what happens is that the nucleus of each uranium atom. So I'm gonna just basically say that these little dots represent, obviously it's not a fair depiction, but they represent the they represent uranium atoms. Okay, of course, anything that's chemical or whatever consists of atoms. Okay, we find atoms everywhere. Okay, but what happens is that these little atoms, okay, so if we obviously have a look here, that this little dot here is an enlarged version of a uranium atom. Okay, inside the uranium atom, which I'm going to use a little black dot for. Okay, that black dot there is what's known as a nucleus. Okay, so each atom has a nucleus of the inside. Okay, now the nucleus of each uranium atom will break down and the atom will split into two atom parts. Okay, so in other words, this is going to halve down the middle. Okay, and we're going to have something like this. Okay, we're going to have now two, all right, uranium atoms. I'm just going to have to push the pen size down here, that have nucleus of their own. Okay, don't know if you can see the black dot in the middle of the second one. Let me try and get that a little bit bigger there. There we go, as well as this one. All right, so now we've got two uranium atoms. Okay, so we've got this now, we've got times two atoms. Okay, now this whole process, if I just increase the brush size a little bit, this whole process is called nuclear fission. Okay, now during nuclear fission, huge amounts of energy will be given off when this reaction happens as heat, and that energy will be given off as heat. Okay, and then that will be used to boil water to produce steam. Okay, once that steam has been produced, it will be used to drive turbines in a generator. Then that generator will produce electricity channeled into the national electricity grid. Okay, let's maybe go through that again. The reaction happens is that because a atom in a piece of uranium splits, or the nucleus splits into two parts, okay, or it splits into two atoms, called nuclear fission. And when that happens, of course, there is a nuclear reaction and a lot of energy is given off. When the energy is given off, it's given off as in the form of heat, and that heat is used to boil water, which in turn releases water vapor, which is known as steam. And that steam is used to drive a turbine in a generator, which produces electricity, which will be channeled, of course, into the national electricity grid. Right? Now, of course, I'm sure that these reactions can't happen on a very, very large scale, because if anything goes wrong and too much energy is given off, well, it will take out quite a large piece of the Western Cape, I feel, because a nuclear explosion happens over a large amount of kilometer radius. Okay, so if too much heat is given off, it could obviously incur a lot of penalties and consequences for the Western Cape. Okay. And because nuclear power produces nuclear waste, and that's our next topic. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the use of nuclear power does produce something that is obviously called nuclear waste, or spent nuclear fuel. In other words, if it's something is spent, money spent, means you can't get that money back to spend. It's spent, it's gone from your personal use, it's gone from your wallet, it's gone from your bank account. You can't get it back unless you obviously, of course, work to replace it. But then that's with obviously new money. So the money spent that you once had, you no longer have. If you've spent nuclear fuel, you can't get it back. Okay, it's also non-renewable. Okay, so the use of nuclear power does incur or produce nuclear waste, and nuclear waste is, first of all, very radioactive, still very radioactive, and also very toxic. It means it's harmful to us as human beings. Okay, it's very dangerous also because it can remain radioactive, can still give off energy. It may maybe not be enough to maybe cause reaction and generate electricity or something like that, but it can still remain radioactive and still give off some rays, waves, and whatever. for hundreds of years. That's why people. It's been quite a few years since the bombing of in Japan of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, in I think I can't remember which war it was. I'm not gonna misquote it, but I think in Japan they are obviously still living with some radioactiveness. Sorry, Kayla, is that World War Two?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is World War II.
All right, cool.
Oh, wait, are you
It was like
recording right now?
1949, 1948, somewhere around there. So probably World War II, yeah.
Okay, cool. We'll go with it. All right, cool. We'll go with it. No, it's fine. It's fine. We'll go with it. But I
If
mean,
you were recording, I'm so sorry.
no. Caitlin confirmed the date, so that is around the time. Okay, it's fine. We're busy doing natural science, not history. So, but it's cool. But basically, of course, there was a war at the time, and then of course America dropped the bombs. And they were nuclear bombs, of course, nuclear. So obviously a nuclear reaction happened. Okay, but point is, I think in certain parts of Japan where they were obviously hit by the bomb and whatever, there's still pieces of radioactivity, and I think there's still people that die from radioactive waste still to this very day. I think. I don't think you hear much about it though, but obviously in history when you guys do go through that section, I'm sure there will be evidence to obviously back that up. I know that was when I was at school. We learned that people were still obviously suffering from radioactive, I wouldn't say illnesses, disease, and obviously consequences of those radioactive wastes. Because it can remain radioactive even though it happened long ago. Like we heard the dates there, it happened quite a long time ago. Doesn't really matter. Can still remain radioactive for hundreds of years. There is a certain part or piece of Earth called Chernobyl. I can't remember where Chernobyl is found. In which country it is.
Chernobyl.
Sorry, what's
Isn't
that?
it Chernobyl?
Sorry? I can't
Isn't
hear
it
two people.
Chernobyl?
I think people pronounce it differently. I'm pronouncing it Chernobyl because I heard an English or British guy pronounce it as Chernobyl, so I'm just gonna go with Chernobyl.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think it's, if you want to pronounce it Chernobyl, I think that's fine. I think people will still know what you're talking about or what you're talking about. Naam, I think you had a question. What you want?
Isn't that in Russia?
I think it's in Europe. Yes, somewhere around there. Yeah, we're probably gonna have to fact check this. Maybe we can fact check it maybe later on. But I heard this place called Chernobyl, where the place has been declared unsafe for humans because of radioactivity, and but the animals seem to be doing fine over there. I think the footage there can only be filmed via drones. Because people have to wear suits when they walk through there if they want to film any nature documentaries there to see what has happened, how nature's taken over the little town or city or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, it's been declared unsafe and uninhabitable for humans because of the radioactivity or nuclear waste and toxic waste that still exists there. Okay, so if you want to research Chernobyl, okay, you can research it. And I think there is a episode on Netflix, Our Planet. It's on YouTube, I think. You can go watch it. I'll see if I can find the link for it where they'll discuss what we just had a look at now. Anyway, that was just a piece of interesting things that I thought I'd share. Anyway, however, how can we obviously deal with nuclear waste? That's obviously the thing that we want to sort out. How can we deal with nuclear waste? Okay. Well, first of all, it needs to be properly disposed of. All right, so that's not a danger to humans or people or life in general in the future. Okay, so to dispose of it, the waste from the nuclear reaction, it needs to be buried deep on land or at sea, or in the ocean. Okay, got to be buried deep and extremely deep. All right, and not just must it be buried in the ground, but it's got to be buried in thick concrete. Okay, in thick concrete or lead. Okay, lead concrete or lead, as well as stainless steel. Stainless steel containers. A little fact here that nuclear waste from Coburg, okay? So let's just add this in here. Nuclear waste from our Coburg power station here in sunny South Africa. This is buried 600 kilometers away at a place called I think I pronounced this correct, Pits, okay, in the Kalahari Desert. Okay, now the desert, am I spelling desert right? No, I'm spelling desert. Oh, that's awkward. Okay, in the Kalahari Desert, no people live there, alright, because the Kalahari Desert, well, it's a desert, people, obviously. Certain parts of the desert would obviously be habitable, but majority or large part of the desert, very dry area, blah, 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 there's no habitants there. So it's buried 600 kilometers away at the Pits, at Pits in the Kalahari Desert, where there are no people. So no people can be affected by it. Everything's good, disposed of safely over there. Okay, so that's where our nuclear waste goes and is buried. Alright, so we're going to put nuclear to bed for a little bit, because that's what goes on at Coburg. And it only accounts for 5% of the electricity production in South Africa. Alright, but what we see here is a diagram showing parts of the national electricity grid. Okay, and I'm going to use it for my little introduction. Okay, so the national electricity grid, first of all, as we can see, this diagram depicts a network. All right, it's a network or system of interacting parts. Okay, if one part is broken in the network or in the system, probably won't work. Okay, now the first of these parts we see there are power stations. Okay, and we see this diagram here, we've also got a bit of coal as the source of our power. That is obviously the input to our power stations. Okay, now, but at power stations that we see there, electricity is obviously generated. Okay, when the electricity is moved long distances from the power stations to the local area, that will be called transmission. And when electricity is moved to users of the local area, it is called distribution. Okay, so what we can see here is that electricity moving from power stations to the local area, which will be around here, all along these transmission lines, okay, would be the transmission. All right, in other words, electricity is moving all along these lines, okay. When the electricity is moved to the users, like into the households itself, that's called electricity distribution. Okay, now all of these parts form part of the national electricity grid. Okay, a change in one part of the grid affects other parts of the grid because they're all connected together. Okay, so again, the diagram, we got coal as the source that goes into our power stations, where of course electricity is generated. All right, this would be the generator component here. Then we have a transformer, which will also be known as a step-up transformer. Okay, a step-up transformer. And then we'll have the power lines, or the transmission lines, national transmission lines, all going through to a substation, all right, which is also known as a step-down transformer. Okay, where and we'll go through the substation a little bit later. And then of course it's distributed to houses, shops, and other buildings via some underground cables, of course. And we all then have access to electricity that we all pay for via this little network or system called the National Electricity Grid. Okay. Right. Let's talk about power stations first. That's the first component there. So at power stations, obviously, what do? They generate electrical energy and they feed it into the national grid, and they feed it into the national grid at high voltages. All right? At high voltages, okay? Which is basically the unit or representation of electric potential energy per unit charge. Okay, now we've obviously gone through what voltage was when we did circuits, right? But voltage is basically the word given to electrical energy. Okay, so at high energy, large amounts of energy, that's what power stations do. They generate that electrical energy at high voltages. Okay, now when the electricity is made in the power station, we move on to a step-up transformer. Okay, now what a step-up transformer does, let's just write it down here. Step-up transformer. Okay, what it does is that a step-up transformer increases, right, its voltage, right, to about, that's a big number, 275,000 volts. 275,000 volts. Let's just put that in here like this. Okay, quite a high voltage. Okay, now why is a step-up transformer a piece of equipment or device or a piece of machinery used to increase the voltage? It's done to reduce energy loss during the transmission. Okay, low voltage lines will release a lot of energy as waste heat, so it's very uneconomical over long distances. So we need to increase the voltage. That's why we use a step-up transformer that increases the voltage to 275,000 volts to reduce energy loss, because energy is always lost in the form of heat most of the time. That's the most common way we lose energy, electrical energy, is we lose it in the form of heat. That's why batteries go flat, right? Car batteries, but if you want to bring it a little closer to home, cell phone batteries, those Duracell and Energizer AA batteries or AAA batteries. Okay, energy is lost there, obviously, because there's heat that takes place and builds up, and of course the energy is lost. Alright, now power lines is the next part, okay, which happens in transmissions, okay, of the power stations, which work together with stepped up transformers. Power lines, of course, what do? They carry the electricity, okay, and that's obviously called transmission. All right, and they carry that electricity, which is obviously produced or stepped up, of course, at high voltages, okay, across the country, and that will obviously be transmission. Okay, I'll put that here as an extra line. Transmission. Okay, the high voltage wires, they are kept high above the ground. Okay. Now, the reason they are kept high above the ground, I'm not going to say the reason why, it's obvious the reason why, but they're kept high above ground, and those little structures, okay, like if we go here, these little structures where they are connected and everything, they are called pylons. So all those, if you're driving along Grand West or parts of the city, you'll see those little pylons there with all those electricity cables there, or cables running through there. That's what they're called, right? They're called pylons. Okay. And they're very tall, as you can see. Okay, it's very dangerous for people to go near them. And often when you see those pylons, there's obviously a fence built around them so that people don't get in there, because you touch those things and you're going to be smelling like a pack of bacon. Okay, you're going to be cooked, high voltages cooking your body. Okay, so that's why they are so tall and supported by pylons, and not encouraged to obviously go near them, because obviously the power lines, they're the most dangerous because they are obviously conductors of electricity. Electricity is running through them constantly. All right, it's almost like an electricity highway, like the N1 almost, or N2. Okay, so those are very dangerous. In places such as like India and stuff like that, power lines are not as protected as what we have in South Africa. So sometimes people get a little crazy and they go touch them. And there has been obviously lots of videos going around of people doing that and being electrocuted. And that's very sad, of course, to see countries not protecting these little places or the electricity grids. All right. Anyway, don't want to get bleak. Okay. third part there would be, of course, now in the diagram, the step down transformers, all right, or substations. Okay, but we're going to stick with their little big term here, step down transformers. Okay, now this is used, of course, to convert that high voltage, bring it a bit lower, because we want to use electricity safely. Okay, so these substations or these step down transformers reduces the high voltage that's coming along the lines, okay, the high voltage, to a safer 240 volts, which we'll just use capital V, 240 volts. This is for distribution to the homes and to other buildings. Okay, in each area of South Africa, there are step down transformers. Okay, there's one actually opposite my house. Okay, that reduces the voltage for distributors such as municipalities and, of course, consumers. Okay, now when electricity travels from the power station to the distributors and consumers, some energy is lost as heat. Okay, about 15%, all right, of energy is wasted, okay, or is lost, okay, due to heating of the transmission wires and the transformers. All right, those things do heat up, the wires do heat up, okay, so it is lost. Okay, and of course that makes sense, common sense, or at least to me, that would be this type of reaction happening, because there's a lot of energy. Okay, any energy lost as heat cannot be used for the work that we wanted, or that we want to use it for, or that we want it for, because it's gone, it's lost as heat. How do you take heat and convert it back into volts? It's virtually impossible, right? Unfortunately, that cannot be happen. All right. Now, as you know, living in South Africa, what a time to be alive. All right, electricity is disrupted. Okay, electricity supply can be disrupted by power surges, all right, as well as grid overload. Okay, now what is a power surge? Let's actually add that as a definition. Just add it in a different color. A power surge, focusing on the word surge here, okay, basically is an oversupply. An oversupply of voltage from the power station or the power company. Okay, in this case, companies that supply electricity would be like Eskom. Okay, it's oversupply. Now, this power surge can last up to 50 microseconds. Even though surges are very short, they could damage computers and electronic equipment. If there's an oversupply of electricity, of course it can damage lot of these electronic devices, and nothing's worse than having a computer component burn out, or like TV just blow out, or internally because of an oversupply of voltage because there was a power surge. All right, now a grid overload, this what happens is when the demand for electricity right? The demand for electricity exceeds capacity. In other words, the demand for electricity is more than what we can actually supply. Okay, the grid can only supply so much, but the demand is too much. In other words, to run correctly, the grid needs to be able to balance the amount it's carrying, which is the capacity, all right, with the demand for electricity by consumers, with how many households exist, what the households would like to run, etc. Because obviously some things, or some electronic devices, some machinery require a little bit more output of electricity to be powered than others. All right, so yeah, that's what actually happens. Now, if the demand for electricity along one transmission line exceeds its capacity, the supply will fail. All right, that's something good that we can obviously write down if we got asked this question. If, and I'll try and shorten this, demand for Okay, along one transmission. Along one transmission line exceeds its capacity, supply will fail. Or supply of electricity will obviously fail. Cool. Now this will put extra strain on the other transmission lines, which may then also fail. And then of course a lot of transmission lines failing, well then we're going to have power outages. Now to keep the system running, it's important that demand stays below capacity of the grid so that the grid doesn't become overloaded, of course. Now, recently in South Africa, the electricity supply company Eskom had to cut electricity supplies to some areas so that the load was reduced to keep transmission lines safe. And that's what happens when we have our famous little word here called load shedding. Okay. Load shedding, of course, when there's too much demand, so Eskom has to cut back supply. Because Eskom is our electricity supply company. Cuts back supply. And of course, we have not had load shedding in a while, but let's not speak like too loudly about it because they might be listening. And I'm not going to even say to some areas, I'm going to say to areas, okay? Of course. Because municipalities also supply electricity, so like City of Cape Town, obviously also is our electricity supplier. So if it's cut to them, it'll be cut to us as well. Thank you, grade 9s, for joining us here on the last session on energy and the national electricity grid. We've just ended off with the gist and with the crux of this topic. We go on to the next topic, which is the cost of electrical power, which is the last section for electricity here in the grade 9, and then we put this to bed. Of course, moving on to term 4 work. Okay, please don't forget to like and comment on the video if you enjoyed it, and also subscribe to our channel, Good, Better, Best online videos, and we will catch you in the next one.